Picture this, a courtroom in downtown Atlanta where the morning sunlight streams through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. It's just another Tuesday morning in 2019, and Judge Marcus Thompson is adjusting his robes before heading to his chambers. After 15 years on the bench, he's earned a reputation as one of the most respected judicial figures in Georgia. But today isn't going to be like any other day. The security checkpoint at the courthouse entrance is usually a brief formality for Judge Thompson. He's walked through these halls thousands of times, greeting the same familiar faces, exchanging warm smiles with the staff who've known him for years. But today, there's a new officer on duty, Officer James Barrett, recently transferred from a smaller county. As Judge Thompson approaches the security line, briefcase in hand, something feels different. The usual morning chatter dies down, and the air grows thick with tension. What happens next would not only test the limits of human dignity, but also challenge our deepest assumptions about power, respect, and the ability to rise above prejudice. "Sir, I need you to step aside." Officer Barrett's voice cuts through the quiet lobby. His tone carries an edge that makes several heads turn. Judge Thompson, dressed in a crisp suit beneath his judicial robes, pauses. For a moment, he's not a judge with decades of experience. He's just another black man being singled out by a white officer. "I'm Judge Thompson," he says calmly, reaching for his courthouse ID. But Officer Barrett is already motioning him toward a separate area, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Sure you are. And I'm the President of the United States." The officer's sarcasm draws uncomfortable glances from the growing crowd of courthouse employees and morning visitors. What follows is a scene that would later be described by witnesses as both heartbreaking and transformative. Officer Barrett, seemingly unmoved by the protests of nearby court staff who know the judge well, proceeds to subject Judge Thompson to a humiliating public search. Arms out, legs spread, he commands, his voice carrying a hint of satisfaction that makes several onlookers wince. Throughout the ordeal, Judge Thompson remains surprisingly composed. His eyes, meeting those of familiar faces in the crowd, hold something unexpected, not anger, not hatred, but something else entirely. It's an expression that would later become the talk of the courthouse and eventually the entire city. The morning's events could have easily exploded into headlines about racism in the justice system, about abuse of power, about everything wrong with our society. Instead, what happened next would challenge everyone's expectations and offer a masterclass in human dignity and wisdom. As Officer Barrett finally finishes his unnecessarily thorough search, clearly finding nothing suspicious, Judge Thompson does something that leaves everyone speechless. But before we reveal his response, a reaction that would change not only Officer Barrett's life, but influence an entire community, let's understand what was really at stake that morning. This wasn't just about a white officer and a black judge. It was about a moment that would test the very principles that Judge Thompson had spent his career upholding: justice, fairness, and the belief that every person, regardless of their actions, deserves the chance to learn and grow. The courthouse lobby had fallen completely silent. Court clerks, attorneys, and citizens waiting for their morning hearings all stood frozen, watching this scene unfold. Some had their phones out, expecting the situation to escalate into yet another viral video of racial injustice. But Judge Thompson had different plans. In his 15 years on the bench, he had seen humanity at its worst and its best. He had handed down sentences that changed lives, presided over cases that tested his faith in justice, and witnessed countless moments of both cruelty and redemption. But perhaps nothing had prepared him for this moment quite like his grandfather's words, spoken to him decades ago on their front porch in rural Georgia. "Son, the true measure of a man isn't how he treats those who respect him, but how he responds to those who don't." As Officer Barrett finally steps back, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth, Judge Thompson straightens his robes. The next few words he speaks would not only shock everyone present, but would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge our understanding of forgiveness, dignity, and the power of human connection. What Judge Thompson does next defies every expectation, breaks every stereotype, and offers a lesson that extends far beyond the walls of that courthouse. His response, unexpected, powerful, and deeply human, reminds us that sometimes the most profound changes begin in the most difficult moments. But before we reveal Judge Thompson's remarkable reaction, it's important to understand that what happens next isn't just about proving Officer Barrett wrong. It's about something much bigger. A moment that would spark conversations across the city, inspire a movement within the justice system, and demonstrate that even in our most humiliating moments, we have the power to choose how our story unfolds. As Judge Thompson opens his mouth to speak, the entire courthouse holds its breath, waiting to see how this story will unfold. The weight of silence in that courthouse lobby feels almost physical as Judge Thompson takes a deep breath. His mind drifts briefly to that morning's breakfast with his teenage son, who had been asking about dealing with prejudice at his new high school. "Sometimes, son," he had said, "the hardest battles aren't fought with fists, but with wisdom." Now, standing here, those words echo in his thoughts. As Judge Thompson begins to speak, his voice carries the same measured tone he's known for in his courtroom, neither angry nor defeated, but filled with an authority that comes from somewhere deeper than his judicial position. "Officer Barrett," he says, causing the smirk to freeze on the officer's face, "would you join me in my chambers for a moment?" The request catches everyone off guard. The courthouse regulars exchange glances, while a few whisper among themselves. They've seen Judge Thompson handle difficult situations before, but this feels different. Officer Barrett's confidence wavers for the first time that morning, his hand unconsciously adjusting his badge. What few people in that lobby knew was that exactly 30 years ago, a young Marcus Thompson had stood in a similar situation, except he wasn't wearing judge's robes then, just a college sweatshirt and jeans. That experience had shaped his path toward law school, toward becoming the kind of judge who could make a difference. But he'd never imagined he'd be testing those principles quite like this. The walk to the judge's chambers feels like an eternity. The click of shoes against marble floors echoes through the corridors, each step building tension. Officer Barrett follows behind, his earlier bravado diminishing with each stride. The same man who minutes ago had publicly humiliated a judge now looks increasingly uncertain about what awaits him behind those heavy wooden doors. As they approach the chamber entrance, Ms. Eleanor, Judge Thompson's clerk of 12 years, steps forward with concern etched on her face. She's seen the judge handle countless difficult situations with grace, but the look she gives him now carries decades of shared understanding about what it means to be black in a position of authority. The judge gives her a subtle nod, one that says both "I'm okay" and "trust me on this." Inside the chambers, morning sunlight filters through Venetian blinds, creating strips of light across the judge's desk. Photos line the walls, images of Judge Thompson with his family, with community leaders, at graduation ceremonies where he's spoken. One particular photo, slightly faded but prominently displayed, shows a young Thompson standing with his grandfather outside their first family home in Atlanta. Officer Barrett's eyes scan the room, taking in the law degrees from Emory University, the various awards for judicial excellence, and the community service plaques that cover nearly an entire wall. The realization of his mistake begins to dawn on his face, but Judge Thompson isn't interested in mere embarrassment or a quick apology. Instead, the judge walks to his desk and pulls out an old, worn leather folder. "Before we discuss what happened out there," he begins, "I'd like to share something with you." His hands rest on the folder, and for a moment, he pauses, as if weighing the significance of what he's about to reveal. What that folder contains, and why Judge Thompson chooses this moment to share it, speaks to a deeper story that goes beyond this morning's confrontation. It connects to a pattern of similar incidents across the country, the conversations happening in homes and workplaces, to the very heart of how we handle prejudice and power in America. But there's something else at play here, too. As Judge Thompson begins to open the folder, Officer Barrett notices the judge's hands. They're steady, calm, showing no sign of the anger or frustration that anyone else might feel in this situation. It's this detail that starts to crack something in Barrett's defensive armor. The story contained in that folder would challenge everything Officer Barrett thought he knew about authority, about justice, and about the man standing before him. But before Judge Thompson can begin to explain, there's a knock at the chamber door. Ms. Eleanor enters with an urgent message that adds yet another layer to this already complex morning. The message she carries isn't just about courthouse business, it's about something that happened earlier that week, something that connects directly to why Officer Barrett was transferred to this courthouse in the first place. As she hands the note to Judge Thompson, her eyes move between the two men, understanding that she's witnessing something far more significant than a simple confrontation between a judge and an officer. Judge Thompson reads the note, and for the first time that morning, his composed expression shifts slightly. He looks at Officer Barrett with new understanding, as if seeing him through a different lens. The judge places the note on his desk, next to the still unopened folder, and leans back in his chair. The tension in the room shifts, becoming something more complex than simple antagonism or authority. There's a story emerging here that's bigger than either man expected when they woke up this morning. It's a story about assumptions and appearances, about the weight of past experiences, and about the unexpected connections that can emerge in the midst of conflict. As Judge Thompson prepares to speak again, the morning sunlight catches the edge of that mysterious folder, highlighting its worn edges and the weight of whatever history it contains. The next few minutes in this chamber wouldn't just address what happened in the lobby, it would uncover something far more profound about both men's journeys to this moment. The note on Judge Thompson's desk seems to carry the weight of untold stories. As he looks up at Officer Barrett, his expression shifts from stern authority to something more complex, understanding mixed with concern. "Tell me, Officer Barrett," he begins, his voice gentle but firm, "what brought you to our courthouse from Clayton County?" Barrett shifts uncomfortably in his chair, his earlier arrogance replaced by an uncertainty he clearly isn't used to showing. Outside the chamber windows, the morning bustle of the courthouse continues, but in here, time seems to stand still. The question hangs in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. "It wasn't my choice," Barrett finally admits, his voice barely above a whisper. The words seem to cost him something to say, his hands, resting on his knees, clenched slightly. "There was an incident," he trails off, looking anywhere but at the judge. Judge Thompson nods slowly, tapping the note on his desk. "Yes, I'm reading about that incident right now. A confrontation with a black teenager outside a convenience store." He pauses, letting the words settle. "The report says you were convinced he was shoplifting. Turns out he was the owner's son, helping close up for the night." Barrett's face reddens, but there's something in his expression beyond simple embarrassment, a glimpse of pain, perhaps even shame. The judge notices this subtle shift, remembering something his grandmother used to say, "Hurt people hurt people." Meanwhile, in the lobby, word of what happened earlier has spread quickly. Ms. Eleanor fields questions from concerned colleagues while trying to maintain order in the judge's absence. She thinks back to similar incidents over the years, remembering how Judge Thompson handled each one with a wisdom that often surprised everyone involved. Inside the chambers, Judge Thompson finally opens the worn leather folder. Inside are newspaper clippings, some yellow with age. The top one, dated 1989, shows a younger version of himself in a college sweatshirt, standing outside a different courthouse. The headline reads, "Local student files complaint against police officer, sparks community dialogue." 30 years ago, Judge Thompson begins, his voice taking on the tone he often uses when mentoring young lawyers. "I was pre-law at Emory. One night, leaving the library, an officer stopped me. He was convinced I'd stolen the books in my backpack." He pauses, watching Barrett's reaction carefully. What happened next changed both our lives. As he speaks, another knock at the door interrupts them. This time, it's Officer Rodriguez, Barrett's supervisor. She enters with a concerned look, carrying a file of her own. "Judge Thompson, I apologize for the interruption, but there's something you need to see regarding Officer Barrett's history." The tension in the room shifts again as Rodriguez places the file next to the judge's folder. Barrett's face drains of color. Clearly, whatever is in that file isn't something he wanted brought to light. But Judge Thompson's expression remains unchanged, his eyes still focused on the old newspaper clipping. "Before we open this," Judge Thompson says, gesturing to Rodriguez's file, "I want to share what happened after that night 30 years ago. The officer who stopped me, Officer Daniel Matthews. He's the reason I'm sitting in this chair today." Barrett looks up, confusion clear on his face. This isn't how he expected this conversation to go. Outside, the morning sun has fully risen, casting the chamber in warm light that seems at odds with the heavy atmosphere within. "You see," Judge Thompson continues, "Officer Matthews could have let his pride, his prejudice, or his power guide his actions that night. Instead, he chose to listen, to learn. What he did next." The judge pauses, looking between Barrett and Rodriguez. "Well, That's surprisingly similar to what's in this new file about you, Officer Barrett. Rodriguez steps forward, her hand resting on the file she brought. Judge, there's something else you should know. The teenager from the convenience store incident, his father reached out to us this morning. He's asking to meet with Officer Barrett, but not for the reasons we might think. The judge nods slowly, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He reaches for both files, the one containing his past and the one holding Barrett's present, and places them side by side. Sometimes, he says, the hardest moments in our lives have a way of connecting in ways we never expect. As he opens both files, the story they tell together begins to reveal something none of them saw coming. A pattern emerges, linking past and present, connecting lives in ways that challenge everything they thought they knew about justice, redemption, and the power of facing our own prejudices. The silence in Judge Thompson's chambers grows heavier as he begins reading from both files. Officer Barrett's leg bounces nervously, a gesture that seems out of place for someone who carried himself so confidently just an hour ago. Officer Rodriguez stands by the window, her shadow casting long lines across the carpet as the morning sun climbs higher. 6 months ago, Judge Thompson reads aloud, his voice steady and clear. You responded to a call about a disturbance at Grove Park Community Center. He looks up at Barrett, whose face has gone completely still. According to this report, you found a group of young black men playing basketball after hours. But instead of immediately confronting them, the judge pauses, studying Barrett's reaction. Barrett swallows hard, his eyes fixed on the floor. I recognized one of them, he says quietly. From another call, weeks before. He was. Barrett's voice catches, and for the first time that morning, his tough exterior cracks completely. Officer Rodriguez steps forward. That young man was Marcus Hayward, she adds, her voice gentle, the same teenager Barrett had wrongly accused at the convenience store. She looks at Judge Thompson meaningfully. What Officer Barrett did that night at the community center isn't in any official report, but Marcus's father made sure we knew about it. Meanwhile, outside in the courthouse lobby, whispers circulate about what's happening behind those chamber doors. Miss Eleanor manages the growing crowd of curious onlookers, including several judges who have heard about the morning's incident. Among them stands an elderly man who arrived just moments ago, Officer Daniel Matthews, now retired, the very officer from Judge Thompson's past. Back in the chambers, Judge Thompson pulls out another document from his old leather folder. Officer Barrett, before we continue, I want you to look at this. He slides a faded photograph across the desk. It shows a young black teenager in handcuffs, tears streaming down his face, standing outside a library. That's me, 30 years ago, the night that changed everything. Barrett looks at the photo, then at the judge, his face a mix of emotions he can't quite hide. The connection between past and present hangs in the air like a physical thing, waiting to be acknowledged. But here's what you don't know, Judge Thompson continues, pulling out another photo. This was taken 6 months later. The image shows the same young Thompson, now smiling, standing between Officer Matthews and a group of other police officers outside a community center. Before he can explain further, there's another knock at the door. Ms. Eleanor enters, her expression urgent. Judge Thompson, sir. Officer Matthews is here. She pauses, glancing at Barrett. And Marcus Hayward and his father just arrived too. The tension in the room reaches a breaking point. Barrett stands abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I can't. He begins, but Judge Thompson raises his hand. Officer Barrett, the judge says, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. What happened at that community center 6 months ago? What did you do that Marcus's father wanted us to know about? Barrett's hands are trembling now, all pretense of authority stripped away. He looks between the judge and Rodriguez, then at the door where he knows Marcus Hayward waits. The story he's about to tell, the real reason he was transferred to this courthouse, isn't what anyone expects. Judge Thompson leans forward, picking up both the old photo of himself and the new file about Barrett. Sometimes, he says softly, our biggest moments of shame can lead to our greatest opportunities for change. Just ask Officer Matthews. As if on cue, the door opens wider. Officer Matthews, now in his 70s but still standing tall, steps into the chamber. Behind him, Marcus Hayward and his father wait in the doorway. The moment feels charged with 3 decades of history, prejudice, redemption, and possibility. Barrett looks like he might bolt from the room, but something in Judge Thompson's expression holds him there. The judge stands, walking around his desk until he's face to face with the officer who had humiliated him just an hour before. Before anyone says another word, Judge Thompson announces, picking up the mysterious note that started this deeper conversation, "There's something everyone in this room needs to know about what really happened that night at Grove Park Community Center." As they file out of the chambers, the morning's hostility transformed into something unexpectedly hopeful. Judge Thompson pauses. "Oh, and Officer Barrett. Next time you want to check my credentials." He smiles warmly. "Just remember to look up at my portrait in the main hall. Right next to it, you'll find a smaller photo of a young man in handcuffs outside a library, and the officer who changed his life." The tension in Judge Thompson's chambers crackles as he holds up the mysterious note, his eyes moving between Officer Barrett and Marcus Hayward. "Before I read this," he says, his voice carrying quiet authority, "I want everyone to understand something. What happened this morning at that security checkpoint wasn't just about power or prejudice. It was about fear." Officer Barrett shifts uncomfortably, but Judge Thompson continues. "Fear is what made a young officer stop me outside that library 30 years ago. Fear is what made you confront Marcus at his father's store. And fear is what drove your actions this morning." He pauses, letting his words sink in. "But it's what we do with that fear that defines us." Marcus steps forward, surprising everyone by speaking directly to Barrett. "When you showed up at the community center that night, we were all ready for the worst. We'd seen the videos, heard the stories, but then you did something none of us expected." Barrett's face flushes red as Marcus continues. "You sat down on those bleachers and talked to us, really talked, about growing up in a small town where you never knew any black people, about your first week as an officer in Atlanta, when everything you thought you knew got turned upside down, about being scared of making mistakes and then making them anyway." Officer Rodriguez quietly places another document on the judge's desk. "This is why Officer Barrett was really transferred here," she says softly. "After that night at the community center, he started a program. Every Friday night, he brings officers to play basketball with kids from different neighborhoods. But he does something else too." Judge Thompson unfolds the document, his eyebrows rising as he reads. "You have them trade places," he says, looking up at Barrett. "The kids put on police gear, and the officers wear regular clothes. You make them walk in each other's shoes." Retired Officer Matthews steps forward, his eyes bright with understanding. "Just like what you did with me, Marcus," he says to Judge Thompson. "Remember? You made me sit in the library with those law books while students walked past, staring at me like I didn't belong." But there's more to the story. Miss Eleanor enters again, this time with a tablet showing security footage from that morning's checkpoint incident. "Judge," she says urgently, "you need to see what happened right before Officer Barrett stopped you." The footage plays, revealing something no one in the room expected. Moments before Judge Thompson arrived, Barrett had received a text message. The camera catches him reading it, his hands shaking as he puts away his phone. Judge Thompson pauses the video, looking at Barrett with new understanding. "Your daughter," he says quietly. "She was in an accident this morning." Barrett's tough exterior finally cracks completely. "They said she was hurt bad," he whispers. "I couldn't leave my post, but all I could think about was getting to the hospital. When you walked in, looking so confident, so in control." His voice trails off. Judge Thompson stands, removing his robes. Underneath, he's wearing the same kind of ordinary suit Barrett had assumed meant he couldn't really be a judge. "Officer Barrett," he says, "life has a way of testing us at our weakest moments. What matters isn't that we stumble, but how we choose to get back up." Then comes the final twist. Marcus's father steps forward with one last revelation. "The reason we came here today wasn't just about that basketball program," he says. "When we heard about Officer Barrett's daughter, the kids from the community center took up a collection. They've been sitting in the hospital waiting room since dawn, taking turns keeping her company until her father could get there." The room falls silent as Barrett processes this information. Judge Thompson picks up his robes again, but instead of putting them on, he hands them to Barrett. "Sometimes," he says, "we need to see ourselves through others' eyes to understand our true power, not the power of authority, but the power of human connection." Miss Eleanor appears one last time, her face bright with news. Officer Barrett, your daughter's awake, and she has some visitors. Seems like half the youth basketball league is in her room. They're asking if their favorite referee will make it to tomorrow's game. Barrett looks around the room, at the judge he disrespected, the teenager he wrongly accused, the retired officer who'd walked this path before him, and his supervisor who saw his potential beneath his mistakes. In this moment, something shifts fundamentally in how he sees his role in the justice system. Judge Thompson, he says finally, standing straighter but with a new kind of confidence, one built on humility rather than authority, would you do me the honor of coming to tomorrow's game? Not as a judge, not as the man I wronged this morning, but as someone who knows better than anyone that sometimes our worst moments can lead to our greatest transformations. The next afternoon, the Grove Park Community Center buzzes with an energy unlike any other game day. The usual crowd of teenagers and police officers has grown to include courthouse staff, local residents, and even a few other judges who heard about yesterday's events. Judge Thompson arrives early, dressed casually in jeans and a polo shirt, carrying the same worn leather folder from his chambers. Officer Barrett is already there, his daughter Emily watching from her wheelchair near the court, surrounded by the teenagers who had kept her company at the hospital. The fear and tension from yesterday's courthouse confrontation feel like a distant memory in this sunlit gym filled with laughter and bouncing basketballs. I never thought I'd see this, Officer Matthews says quietly to Judge Thompson as they watch Barrett teaching some kids proper shooting technique. 30 years ago, when I stopped you outside that library, I couldn't have imagined we'd be standing here today. Judge Thompson smiles, opening his folder to share something he'd been saving. Inside is a newspaper clipping from just last week, before the courthouse incident. The headline reads, "Local police officers' youth basketball program bridges community divides." The article features a photo of Barrett and Marcus playing basketball with a group of kids, though Barrett hadn't known it was being written. Sometimes, Judge Thompson says, loud enough for Barrett to hear as he approaches, our greatest impact happens when we're not trying to make one at all. He hands the article to Barrett, whose eyes widen in recognition. This is why you were really transferred to our courthouse. The community liaison position was created because of what you started here. Marcus joins them, now wearing a whistle around his neck. He's been helping coach the younger kids in the program. My dad always says that change doesn't happen in courtrooms or police stations, he offers. It happens on basketball courts, in coffee shops, in all the small places where people stop seeing uniforms and start seeing each other. The game begins, but it's unlike any previous match. Judge Thompson and Officer Barrett play on the same team, their previous confrontation transformed into cooperation. Miss Eleanor keeps score, occasionally trading playful banter with Officer Rodriguez, who's refereeing. Even Emily, despite her wheelchair, gets involved, calling out plays and keeping stats. During a water break, Barrett finally shares what was really behind his behavior at the courthouse. When I got that text about Emily's accident, he admits, wiping sweat from his face, all I could think about was losing control. Checking your credentials, Judge Thompson. It was the only control I thought I had left at that moment. Judge Thompson nods understanding. Fear makes us reach for whatever power we think we have, he responds. The challenge is learning to reach for connection instead. The afternoon winds down with an unexpected ceremony. Marcus's father presents both Barrett and Judge Thompson with honorary whistles, symbolizing their new roles as program mentors. But the real surprise comes from Emily, who wheels herself to center court with help from her new teenage friends. When I woke up in the hospital, she says, her voice carrying across the now quiet gym, I was scared and alone. Then these kids showed up. Kids my dad had told me about from his basketball program. They didn't know me, but they stayed. They showed me what my dad's been learning here all along. That community is stronger than fear. As the sun sets outside, casting long shadows through the gym's high windows, Judge Thompson gathers everyone for a final word. He pulls out one last item from his folder, a black and white photo of himself as a young man, standing with Officer Matthews outside that library 30 years ago. Yesterday morning, an officer stopped a judge at a security checkpoint. He begins, his voice resonating with 3 decades of perspective. But what really happened was that 2 human beings had a chance to see past their fear and find something bigger than their badges or robes. Officer Barrett. He turns to face him directly, You've helped create something here that's more powerful than any authority our uniforms give us. Barrett stands a little straighter, but it's a different kind of pride now, not the defensive authority he'd shown at the checkpoint, but the quiet confidence of someone who's found his true purpose. "Thank you, Your Honor," he says, then catches himself and smiles. "I mean, thank you, Coach." The gymnasium erupts in laughter, and as people begin to gather their things, new connections form naturally. Courthouse staff chat with teenagers about college plans, officers discuss community programs with local parents, and Emily makes plans to help coach the younger kids once her leg heals. Judge Thompson takes one last look around before leaving, watching Officer Barrett lock up the gym with the same care he once used to guard the courthouse entrance. Tomorrow, they'll both return to their official duties, one to the bench, the other to the security checkpoint. But something fundamental has shifted in how they'll see each other and everyone else who passes through those courthouse doors. As Judge Thompson drives home, he thinks about what his grandfather told him on that porch so many years ago. The true measure of a man isn't how he treats those who respect him, but how he responds to those who don't. Today, in a community center gym, that wisdom had come full circle, proving that sometimes the greatest victories in justice happen far from any courtroom.